Let me tell you about the night a waitress changed the life of a man who thought nothing could change him. Rafael Moro had spent 20 years building a world where he controlled everything, every room, every deal, every word spoken in his presence. He was the kind of man who did not lose, not because he was lucky, because he had learned, the hard way, that the person who controls the language controls everything else. Then his interpreter disappeared the night before the most important meeting of his career, and the only replacement available was a woman working the dinner shift at a 12-table restaurant in Lower Manhattan. A woman who, 48 hours earlier, had picked up his tip money and put it back on an empty table, like it was something she didn't want to touch. He needed her, and she knew it, and she went anyway. What unfolds across 7 days in Seoul is the kind of story that doesn't happen in movies because it's too quiet for movies. No explosions, no chases, just two people in a series of rooms, and the slow realization that the thing Rafael Moro had been missing his entire life was not more power. It was someone honest enough to tell him what his words actually meant. This channel is dedicated to the stories behind men who built empires, not the violence, not the crime, but the thinking, the discipline, the moments of real humanity underneath the armor. Some people are born to lead. Some truths are only earned through experience. Some lessons no classroom will ever teach you. Only people who have actually stood at the edge of everything understand what keeps you there. This channel is about mindset, about character, and about the kind of power that doesn't disappear when the room clears. Here's what this story is really about. We spend so much of our lives being carefully managed versions of ourselves, choosing the right words, protecting the right image, and somewhere underneath all of that, we are waiting, without knowing, we are waiting for one person who translates us correctly, who hears not just what we say, but what we mean, who sees the person we are in the language we speak when no one else is listening. Vera found that in herself first. Then she gave it to someone who needed it. That is the rarest kind of strength there is. If you felt something in that, I need you to do 3 things right now. Hit like, because stories like this deserve to travel. Drop a comment. Tell me which moment stayed with you. I read every single one. And subscribe, because we go deeper every week into the minds and the stories of the people who refuse to be ordinary. The best things in life don't come looking for you. They come when you're doing your best work and you look up. This channel is where you look up.
Rafael Moro had walked into rooms where everyone wanted him dead and walked out with what he came for. He had done it in New York, in Palermo, say, and once, memorably, in the back office of a car dealership in Phoenix that smelled like burnt coffee and bad decisions. See, he had never done it in a place just where he couldn't understand a single word being spoken around him. That, he was about to discover, was an entirely different category of problem. But that was tomorrow. Tonight he was sitting at the corner table of a small Italian restaurant in Lower Manhattan, waiting for who was already 12 minutes late, and trying not to think about the fact that the espresso here were as good as what his mother used to make in her kitchen on Sunday morning back in New Jersey. Trattoria Venti was not Rafael Moro's kind of place. He owned 3 restaurants, technically. Co-ownership stakes, the kind that looked clean because they mostly were clean, up to a point. He had people who handled reservations, wine lists, the right kind of lighting. He ate in places where the staff knew better than to let a water glass go empty for more than 30 seconds. This placed tables, warm yellow light, the smell of tomato sauce simmering from somewhere in the back, mismatched chairs, a chalkboard menu. But his associate only agreed to meet in small, quiet places where nobody recognized anybody. So here he was. He sat with his back to the wall, as always. A clear sight line to both exits. Carmine on his left, Danny on his right. The three of them looked like they'd wandered in from a different cities, which they had. The restaurant was maybe half full, a couple near the window, a table of 4 women celebrating something, an older man eating alone with a book. Normal Tuesday night. Raphael scanned the room once and went back to thinking about tomorrow. The Seoul trip was 14 hours away. The meeting with Stone Pacific Logistics was the most important deal he'd been building toward for 3 years. If it closed, it opened an entire East Asian shipping corridor that would change the shape of his operation. And Marco Ricci, his interpreter of 8 years, the man who had just sat beside him in every important meeting from Tokyo to Frankfurt, was supposed to be on that plane. He needed to stop thinking about the Marco situation. He had already thought about it enough. He would deal with it. He always dealt with it. A server appeared at the table, not the kind of appearance that happens when someone walks up, more like the kind that happens when someone who's moving through space monges long enough simply materializes where they need to be. White apron. Hair pulled back neatly, a posture that was straight without being stiff. The ease of someone who had stopped performing this job a long time ago and started just doing it. "What can I get you gentlemen tonight?" she said. American accent, neutral, the kind that comes from learning language from multiple places at once. Carmen was looking at his phone. He waved one hand without looking up. "Bring the menu. And water. Quick." The woman stopped. Not in a flustered way. Not in a way that suggested she was going to say anything back, or miss a scene, or get a manager. She just stopped, for exactly 1 beat. Then she set the menus on the table. Not hard, not soft. Just placed with the particular quality of someone who has registered a tone and chosen not to play along with it. "Menus are right here," she said. "I'll get your water. When you're ready to order, I'm around." She turned and walked away. Carmine Sign stared after her. His mouth was slightly open, not because he felt insulted, but because he hadn't fully processed what had just happened. Raphael watched her walk back toward the kitchen. His expression didn't change. But in the back of his mind, something got filed. The meeting with his associate wrapped in under 20 minutes. Short, as planned. The man left. The table was quieter. Carmine ordered more wine. The server brought it, and Carmine, who apparently needed to finish something he'd started, looked at her in the way that made her pause. "How long you been working here?" he said, the voice he used when he thought he was being charming. "Long enough," she said. "Final. What's your name?" "Not relevant." "I think it's relevant." "Carmine." One word from Raphael. Not loud, not hard. Just one word. Carmine stopped. The server looked at Raphael for the first time, not grateful, not curious, evaluating. Quick and professional, Raphael met her eyes. "Apologies for my colleague." "You didn't do anything wrong," she said. Then, after exactly 1 beat, "But if he uses that tone again, I'll bring the check before he finishes his meal." Carmine's jaw moved without producing words. Raphael almost smiled. "Almost fair enough," he said. She walked away. Danny leaned in. "Boss, she just—" "I saw it," Raphael said. He poured wine into his own glass. Not many people do that. No, when they left, Raphael put cash on the table, more than double the bill. The server was clearing a nearby table and saw it. "Sir." She picked up the bills. "You forgot your change." He was almost to the door. "Didn't forget. I don't take tips like this." He stopped, turned his head just slightly, looking back over one shoulder. "Like what?" "Tips meant to compensate for what you can't apologize for." She set the bills on an empty table beside her. "Good night, Mr. Morrow." He looked at her for a moment, long enough that the room felt it. Then he nodded once and walked out. On the sidewalk, Danny said, "She knows your name. She works in hospitality," Raphael said, eyes forward. "She knows everyone." But in the back of his mind, the thing that had been filed earlier got a second notation shoe beside it. She gave back the tip. Nobody gave back his tip. He was already in the car when his phone rang. David, his assistant, Marco called. "Family emergency. He can't make the Seoul trip." Raf set the phone on his knee, sat still for 10 seconds. Those 10 seconds were the entirety of the time he allowed himself to react. "Who's available?" he said. "I've been through the roster," David said. "Emergency interpreter credentials, Korean, Japanese, English, active MCVC clearance within 60 miles, available to travel in the next 12 hours. A pause. There's only one name that checks all the boxes. Name, Vera Cole. Raphael was quiet. She's the woman from the restaurant tonight. Boss. Trattoria Venti. I know who she is. Her interpreter credentials are real, David continued. 8 years freelance, Lotte Corporation, Samsung, the Korean Embassy in Washington. 3 years with the UN trade delegation in Geneva. She left the profession 2 years ago. Reason unclear. Nothing negative in her file. Why is she waitressing? Nobody got a clear answer on that. Raphael looked out the car window at Manhattan going by. In his head, an image. A woman setting cash on an empty table like it had something contaminated on it, and say his name like the name meant nothing special. Contact her tonight, he said. Whatever her rate is, double it, and tell her I need 45 us in the car for the briefing. She may not agree to contact her. He hung up. His father, Antonino Moro, had come to America from Sicily in 1961 with $40. A cousin's address is in New Jersey, and exactly 0 words of English. He had learned. Slowly, imperfectly, but he had learned. And he had died in a hospital in Newark in 1991, speaking Italian, asking for water, while nurses who couldn't understand him gave him sedatives for the pain they assumed he was describing. Raphael had been 12 years old, standing right there, trying to translate. He hadn't had the words. In 30 years, he had never put himself in a position where he didn't have the words. Not once. That was not an accident. He looked at his own reflection in the car window. 14 hours to Seoul. A city where, if something went wrong and he had to handle it himself, he couldn't say a single thing to anyone. And the person who would be his voice was a woman he had met tonight. A woman who gave back his money by his name, like it was just a name. He would deal with it. He always dealt with it. Vera was wiping down last tables when her phone rang. She looked at the number, didn't recognize it, picked up anyway, because it was nearly midnight and unknown calls at midnight were rarely nothing. The man on the line introduced himself as David Chen, assistant to Raphael Moro. He explained the situation in about 90 seconds. Interpreter needed for a business trip to Seoul. Departing tomorrow morning. Highest professional credentials required. Top of the standard rate. Vera listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Who am I interpreting for and with who? I need full context." David gave her the overview. Stone Pacific Logistics. Contract negotiation, commercial partnership. I'll need 45 minutes in the car for briefing, she said. Not 30. A pause. Mr. Mordro mentioned 45 minutes as well. Good. Send the contract to this number by 6 a.m. 50% upfront, wired before departure. And I operate strictly within professional interpretation standards, nothing outside that scope. Of course. Then I'll be at the pickup point at 7 a.m. She hung up and went back to wiping the table. Carlo, the chef, was shutting down the kitchen behind her. He looked through the pass-through window. You okay? Fine, she said. I'm going to be out for a few days. How many? I don't know yet. He nodded. Carlo had known Vera for 2 years and had learned not to ask too many follow-up questions. She would tell him what she wanted him to know. Anything else was hers. She picked up her bag and walked out into the lower Manhattan night, already thinking about what she needed to review before morning. She still had dragged the briefing documents from her last corporate interpretation contract 2 years ago, the one she had quit after. She had kept everything organized, force of habit. She was not going to think about why she had quit. Not tonight. Tonight was preparation. The pickup was a black car. Raphael was already inside with one man she recognized as the one who had apologized for his colleague at the... He looked at her as she got in. Not surprised, exactly. More like someone confirming something they had already factored in. Verical, he said. Statement. Mr. Morrow. Also a statement. She didn't offer a social smile. I notice you're choosing not to mention last night. Last night was last night, she said. Today is the job. A short pause. Something in his shifted just slightly. I respect that. I need 45 minutes in the car. I have questions. David told me. I told David. He almost smiled. She noticed it and said nothing. She opened her briefing materials. Not a laptop. Paper, because she thought faster with paper. And because she had learned that people trusted someone who wrote things down by hand. There was something about it that said, I am here. paying attention to you specifically. When you say flexible timeline in your draft terms, she said, do you mean you'll negotiate or you won't? Raphael looked at her. What's the difference? In Korea's business culture, flexibility reads as weakness unless it's framed as strategic patience. If you're holding firm, I say it one way. If you're willing to move, say it a completely different way. Same words into English, two different sentences in Korean. I'm not moving on the timeline. Good, I know what to say. She made a note without looking up. Victor Stone was educated in Japan in the 1970s. His formal register is hierarchy first, substance second. The first 3 sentences of any meeting will be about respect and courtesy, not business. Don't rush past them. Don't cut through them. If you do, you've lost him regardless of the numbers. You're not asking if I'm prepared. No, why not? Because whether you're prepared doesn't help me do my job better. These questions do. He was quiet for a moment. She kept writing notes. The city slid past outside. Why did you leave interpretation needs? She didn't look up from the briefing notes. Not relevant. A B. If it becomes relevant, I'll tell you. A beat. Right now, I need you to walk me through stone-specific logistics. He studied her for a moment. Then he talked. The 45 minutes were useful. She filled 6 pages of notes. By the time they reached the airport, she understood not only the contract terms, but the man sitting across from her. In the particular way she understood people who communicated at an angle to what they meant. He was precise. He didn't waste words. He answered exactly what was asked, and nothing more, which was either confidence or training, or both. His eyes moved to the window when he was thinking, and back to her when he had decided. He had the patience of someone who had learned that most situations resolve if you wait long enough without blinking. And there was something underneath all of it, something she had learned to notice in 15 years of sitting in rooms with powerful people. A weight that wasn't about the deal, a weight that had been there longer than the deal. She filed it. Not her place to ask, not yet. The first meeting at Stone Pacific went on the 40th floor of building in Gangnam, with Seoul spread out below them like machine designed to produce maximum outputs for minimum space. Victor's Nara was 68 years old and compact, the kind of man who had been at the head of the table long enough to stop thinking about what it felt like to sit anywhere else. His nephew Tommy stood behind his left shoulder, 28 years old, American educated, clearly uncomfortable in a way that his uncle either didn't notice or had decided not to address. The meeting started in the formal Korean register, which was exactly what Vera had predicted. Victor spent the first 3 exchanges on entries. Vera watched Raphael observe this without rushing it. He had listened in the car. That was good. When the substances started, she translated, not mechanically. She translated the way a musician plays a piece, maintaining the notes while adjusting the tone for the instrument, the moment. Halfway through the first exchange, Victor said something quietly to Tommy in Korean, sideways. Not for the official record. He said, he looks younger than I expected. I'm not sure he has authority to close this himself. Tommy didn't translate it. It wasn't directed at the room. But Vera was the room. She leaned fractionally toward Raphael, barely a movement, voice just above a breath. He just told Tommy, you look too young to have closing authority. Your next sentence, don't explain yourself. Just put something on the table. Raphael didn't blink, didn't change a single muscles in his face. But his next sentence was 3 specific decisions from the last 18 months. Names, numbers, outcomes, not a pitch, a record. Just facts, placed down the way you place a card. Vera translated it in the register of someone reading their own history, not making a case for themselves. Victor's posture shifted. 2 degrees, maybe less. Vera saw it. In the elevator going down afterward, Raphael said, you changed something in my first sentence. I added something you already knew and didn't say. You've been following Stone Pacific. I let him know. You made a decision for me. I made a decision for the meeting. She looked at him directly. If you want word-for-word mechanical conversion, there are apps. That's not what I do. What do you do? I translate meaning. Sometimes meaning and words aren't the same thing. He looked at her for a long moment. And when the meaning I have isn't the meaning you think I should have, then you correct me before I say it. That's what the 45s in the car was for. He nodded. Not capitulation. Agreement. It was the first agreement between them that wasn't about logistics. Next morning in Seoul, Vera arrived at the hotel workroom at 6:45 a.m. with two coffees and her notebook. Raphael was already there, which didn't surprise her. He seemed like a man who had given up on sleeping past 5. He looked at the coffees. You didn't have to. It's practical, she said. Tired interpreters make mistakes. She sat and opened the notebook. He watched her do it. She had noticed him watching the notebook, had noticed it in the car and in the lobby, and in the brief periods between meetings when she was writing, and he was theoretically reviewing documents. There was something about it that caught her attention. I'm going to teach you a word today, she said. He looked up. One word. One word. But if you use it at the right moment, it'll change the temperature of the whole room. She wrote it phonetically on a piece of paper and pushed it across the table. Guayanchanayo, what does that mean? Literal translation is something like it's okay or we're fine, but Koreans use it when they want someone to feel less alone in an uncomfortable moment. It doesn't really convert to English cleanly. The closest thing is, we're okay here, together, inclusive, not dismissive, not from above. Why this word specifically? Because there'll be a moment today that's awkward. When a number doesn't land right or someone says something slightly off. If you say this naturally, without performing it, it tells the other persons that you're present with them in the discomfort, not above it. He repeated the word. His pronunciation was rough. Italian vowels where there shouldn't be. Again, she said, not kindly. Just again. He tried it. Better. My father died in a hospital in Newark, he said. Not connected to what they were talking about. Just said. He spoke Italian. Nobody understood him. He kept saying the word for water. The nurses thought he was describing pain. They sedated him. He died that night. Vera was quiet. She didn't say I'm sorry. She had learned that I'm sorry was often the thing people said when they didn't know what else to do, and it rarely helped. Instead, she received what he'd said the way she received information in a meeting, carefully, without dropping it. That's why, she said, after a moment that was long enough to mean it. That's why that word. Because if someone had said it to your father, even in Korean, even if he didn't understand the language, he would have felt what it meant. Raphael looked at her. You figured that out without asking. I've been serving people food for 3 years. You learn to read what isn't on the menu. He looked down at his hands. She pointed at his left one. That one. He looked up. You look at your left hand when you're deciding whether to trust someone, she said. I noticed it yesterday. He looked at his hand on the table. I didn't know I did that. Most people don't know their tells, she said. That's what makes them useful. She opened her notebook. My notes on you, from the first day. You pause before the most important thing you're going to say. You look left when you're deciding about trust. You change topics when something makes you uncomfortable, but you're not ready to address it. She closed the notebook. Next time you're deciding whether to trust me, you could just look at me instead. He held her gaze. What would I see? Exactly what's there, she said. I don't hide things on my face. I hide them in languages you don't know. He almost said something, then chose not to. Filed it instead. She moved on to the briefing for the second meeting. Between meetings, Marcus Webb, Raphael's local contact in Seoul, asked to see Raphael privately. Vera was not in that meeting, but afterward, Raphael found her in the lobby. Victor is stalling the signature, he said. No clear stated reason. He's been asking Marcus about my shipping manifests from the last 3 imports. He's looking for something, Vera said. That's what it looks like. People who are frightened probe, she said. They don't attack directly. They test the perimeter first. Whatever Victor is afraid of, he suspects it's connected to you. Connected to what specifically? I don't know enough yet, she thought for a moment. But the fact that he's asking about your cargo history rather than your financials tells me something. He's looking for an object, not a number. Raphael studied her. You think like an investigator. I think like someone who's been in too many rooms where people weren't saying what they meant. Eventually, you get good at reading what they actually mean. There was a pause. A real one. Not the kind you fill. Why did you actually leave interpretation? He said. She looked out the window at the Seoul skyline, early evening light catching on glass towers. I once translated a contract, she said. Commercial negotiation. Standard work. 3 weeks later, I found out one side had used specific language from that negotiation to pressure the other party into accepting terms they hadn't agreed to. They extracted a phrase I had translated, took it out of context, and used it as leverage. She paused. I was the conduit. I didn't know what I was building while I was building it. You didn't do anything wrong. Whether I did or didn't isn't really the point, she said quietly. I was the voice of something I wouldn't have chosen to give a voice to. That takes time to work through. You can't just decide it doesn't bother you. So you went and waited tables. So I went and waited tables. A small pause. I chose whose language I wanted to be. Tonight at Trattoria Venti, I knew what I was serving and why. That mattered to me. And here? She looked back at him. Here I know what I'm translating. For who, and toward what end. That's the difference. Dinner that night was at a small restaurant Vera chose in Insadong. Not the hotel restaurant, not five-star. A place with wooden tables and a handwritten menu and food that arrived fast and tasted like someone made it. Raphael looked at the bowl in front of him. Spicy zesp sauce, rice cakes. He didn't ask what it was. He ate it. He finished it. You didn't ask, she said. If you chose it, it's probably worth eating. That's either trust or stubbornness. Both. She almost smiled. Victor is going to test your nunchi tomorrow, she said. Tell me what nunchis is, the ability to read a room, to feel what isn't being said. Koreans consider it the most important social skill, more important than intelligence or status. A person with good nunchi knows when to speak, when to go quiet, when to steer before something goes wrong. I don't have it. You do. You just don't have a word for it. He looked at her with the particular patience of someone waiting for more. You knew I was tired after the second meeting yesterday, and you shortened the post-meeting debrief without being asked, she said. You knew Tommy was uncomfortable in front of his uncle, and you avoided putting him on the spot directly. You feel the room, Raphael.
You just didn't know Koreans had named that skill.
You've been reading me since we met, he said. That's the job. No, he said slowly. The job is translating. What you're doing is different. She looked at her food, didn't deny it. At the end of dinner, a server said something to Vera in Korean. Something small, a question about the food. Vera answered as there was a small joke, and the server laughed, and Vera laughed with her, genuinely. In a way that was completely unguarded, her face in that moment was nothing like her working face. Raphael watched the exchange. What was that about? He said. She asked if the food was good. I said yes. She said Americans are always surprised that spicy food can be this good. I told her you're Italian, not American. She said that explains the face. What face? Vera looked at him. Something close to a real smile. The face that says you're not sure yet if you like something, but you've already decided that you do. For the first times on the trip, Raphael Moros was sitting somewhere and found that he didn't particularly want to get up. The night before the most important meeting was the quietest night of the trip. That was usually a good sign. Raphael had learned, across 20 years of dealing in things that required careful handling, that the nights before worst outcomes were usually the noisiest ones. Your instincts got loud when something was wrong. They got quiet when you were ready. Tonight, his instincts were not quiet. They were saying something he couldn't quite hear. He reviewed the meeting materials in his hotel room until 11 p.m., changed. Was about to get into bed when the thing he couldn't quite hear got louder. He looked at his carry-on. It was on the luggage stand by the window. Same spot he always put it. Same position. He had unpicked his clothes, his documents, his toiletry kit. He had repacked his documents and locked the case as he always did. But there was something. He couldn't have said what exactly. Nothing obvious, nothing he could point to. Just the particular friction of a thing being slightly off that you learn to feel when your livelihood depends on noticings. He took the case off the stand and put it on the bed. He opened it, everything where it should be. He unpacked it again, slowly, checked the side pockets, the main compartment, the document folder. Then he pressed his fingers along the bottom lining. One side was stiffer, got the small knife from his travel kit. He ran it along the edge of the seam, the lining pulled away from a thin envelope sealed with tape that left no residue. The kind of tape designed not to leave marks. He opened the envelope, documents. About 20 pages, dense text. He turned them over, trying to read them. Not English, not Italian. Japanese characters mixed with something older that he recognized vaguely as formal Korean. He stood in the middle of the hotel room in Seoul at midnight and understood 3 things in sequence. 1. Someone had put something in his bag without telling him. 2. He was in a foreign country about to walk into a sensitive negotiation. 3. He had no idea what he was carrying. He reached for his phone, went past David's number, past Marcus Webb's number, stopped on the one below. He called. She picked up on the second ring. "I need you in my room," he said. 12 minutes if you can. "On my way," she said. No questions. She was there in 11. She came in with a small laptop under her arm and the steady expression of someone who had learned not to arrive at a situation already reacting to it. She looked at Raphael, looked at the documents spread on the bed. She sat down, set the laptop aside, and read. He stood and let her read. He had learned in the last two days that Vera Cole worked differently from people. She gathered before she spoke. He could work with that. She read for 2 minutes without saying anything. He counted. Then she said, "This is formal Japanese, written in the early 1990s. Corporate internal records." She turned 3 pages. It documents a series of transactions between Stone Pacific Logistics and a government official. The year is 1998. It's for a port infrastructure contract worth approximately $340 million at that time. She turned another page. There's a line item here described as a consulting fee, but there's no consulting service in the records that corresponds to it. She set the pages down. If this is authentic, it's criminal evidence. Bribery is sufficient for prosecution. "And it was in my luggage," Raphael said. "Yes. Which means either someone planted it to make me look like I came here to blackmail Victor Stone." He paused. Someone is using me to deliver a threat without asking permission." "Or both," Vera said. Silence. "Marco," Raphael said. Not a question. Vera looked up at him. "My interpreter. He packed this bag the day before our departure. He was the last person to handle it before lock. He looked at the documents on the bed. He called for 4 hours before we left with a family emergency. See, convenient." "Yes." Vera looked at him carefully. "What do you want to do with it?" "I want to know what it's first. You've told me what it says. What is it actually? Who does it belong to?" "It belongs to Victor Stone," she says it. "Or rather, it's about him. This is the record of something he did 25 years ago. This document, in the wrong hands, ends his career and his freedom." She paused. "In your hands, a man he's never met before, arriving from America to negotiate a business deal. What do you think he's going to think? That I came here to leverage it. Yes, which I didn't. I know you didn't." She said it simply. "I know you didn't because you called me, not your lawyer." He looked at her. "I need you to tell me something. And I need the honest version. I don't have another version. Who put this in my bag knew my travel schedule weeks in advance. They knew my case. They knew enough to get in and out without any trace except a slightly stiff lining that most people would never check." He picked up the documents and looked at them. "This is careful, patient, professional work. It isn't random. Someone wanted me to walk into that meeting tomorrow carrying this, without knowing it was there. And if Victor Stone finds out you have it, he'll assume I'm here to use it. Which means the meeting tomorrow isn't a business negotiation anymore. No, it's a threat he'll feel like he has to neutralize." Vera was quiet for a moment, looking at the documents, looking at Raphael. "I need to ask you something," she said. "And I need the real answer, not the careful one. So, ask. Are you the kind of person who would use that document to hurt someone? No. Would you let someone else use it if it benefited you? No." She looked at him. Took her time. His left hand was flat on the table, not looking at it, looking at her. "I let interpretation 2 years ago," she said, "because I was once the voice of something I didn't want to be the voice of. I'm not doing that again." She stood up. "But I also can't walk away from someone who walked into a trap they didn't build. You don't have to stay on this job, he said. This isn't what you signed up for. I don't leave zips in the middle of verses, she said. Tomorrow we go to the meeting. You let me handle the language. And tonight, that document needs to leave this room. I have a contact outside Souls, someone I trust outside any of the people on this trip. Then call him. Have it secured somewhere it can't be found and can't be used by anyone. Not Victor Stone's people. Not yours. That's a significant act of good faith. That's the only move that makes you someone Victor Stone might eventually believe. He looked at her for a long moment. Why does it matter to you whether he believes me? She thought about it. Because I've seen what happens in his negotiations when the truth is actually on the table and nobody will let it be the truth. It's the most frustrating thing I've ever witnessed professionally. A real agreement can only be built on something real. He picked up his phone. I'll make the call. I'll stay until it's done. She sat back down. He made the call in Italian, facing the window, fast and precise. She could have told him what he was saying. She didn't. Some things were not her business, and she had learned the difference. When he hung up, he turned around. She was writing in her notebook. He looked at it for a moment. What are you writing? Notes on how to frame tomorrow's meeting given what we now know. He sat down across from her. You're already working on it. We lost an hour. We need to make it back somewhere. He watched her write. Something in her handwriting was familiar to him in the way that things that shouldn't be familiar sometimes are. Like hearing a song in a language you don't speak, and somehow understanding the shape of it. Vera, thank you. She looked up. Don't thank me yet. Thank me if tomorrow doesn't go badly. He almost said something. Chose not to. Filed instead. She left at 1 a.m. He sat in the quiet hotel room for a while after she was gone, looking at the empty bed where the documents had been, thinking about a man who had worked beside him for 8 years, and a lining that was slightly stiffer on one side. Then he went to sleep. The car ride to Stone Pacific the next morning was quiet, not uncomfortable quiet. The quiet of two people who have covered the important ground and don't need to fill the space with noise. Vera was reviewing her notes. Raphael was looking out the window. The city was bright and purposeful in the way of cities that don't pause for sentiment. Vera, yes. If you hear anything in that room that changes the situation, anything at all, tell me in real time. Don't process it first. Don't decide whether it's relevant. Just tell me. You're asking me to take your side. I'm asking you to tell me the truth as it happens. That's different. She considered this. If I hear something that changes the situation in a direction you also won't like, still tell me. She closed her notebook. Okay. One word. But it landed differently than other okays he had heard. The way a door closes differently when it closes on purpose. The 40th floor. Same conference room. The social skyline. The long table. The formal arrangement of people. Victor just looked to Vera like a man who had not slept well. The suit was perfect. The posture was held. But behind the eyes was the specific compression of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and recently started to feel the weight. Tommy stood in his usual position. He gave Vera a quick glance when she sat down. She caught something it, not a signal, just a flicker of something she filed for later. The meeting opened with formalities. Vera in the appropriate register. Raphael let the formalities breathe, did not rush them. She noted this. Victor was careful, every sentence measured. He asked about logistics terms, contract language, specific port-to-port timing, normal meeting questions. But he was also listening to Raphael in a way that had nothing to do with the contract. The kind of listening you do when you're waiting for a person to reveal what they actually know. 20 minutes in, Victor said something to T in Korean. Not loud, not quiet, audible to the whole room, but Tommy didn't translate it because it wasn't directed at the formal session. It was as a side remark. Ask him carefully about the items in his luggage when he arrived. Tommy shifted slightly. The discomfort was visible. Vera leaned half an inch toward Raphael, voice barely above breath. He just told Tommy to ask about your luggage. He knows something's connected to your bags. He doesn't know if you know. Raphael didn't move, didn't pause. continued talking about the timing clauses on the third quarter shipment schedule as if he had heard nothing. Vera matched his pace. 5 minutes later, Raphael made a statement about long-term cooperation, standard language. Victor translated it, and at the end, she added one word in Korean. The word was soljiki. It means something like frankly, but in the context of Korean business conversation, it's a specific signal. It says, "We can stop performing now if you want to." Victor heard it. He stopped writing. He looked at Raphael, not at Vera. Directly at Raphael, with the particular photo effects of someone deciding whether they're being addressed honestly. Raphael held the look, said nothing, just waited. This was the Nunchi moment. Vera knew it and she let it run. Victor spoke, a full sentence in Korean. Vera translated. He says he believes there may have been a misunderstanding about the purpose of this meeting, and he'd like to speak frankly if you're willing. Tell him yes, Raphael says. Vera did. Victor took a breath. Then he talked. He said that 3 days before Raphael arrived in Seoul, he received word through an intermediary in Hong Kong. An American business partner was coming to a meeting carrying documents connected to Victor's past. Documents that, in the wrong hands, could be professionally and personally catastrophic. He said he didn't believe if Raphael had built this situation, but he needed to know where the documents were. The room was very still. Raphael listened to Vera translate every word. Then he looked at Victor's nose and spoke slowly and clearly, knowing that Vera would care to exactly. He said, "I found something in my luggage that I didn't put there. I didn't know it was there until last night. It is no longer in my possession. I have no intention of using it or delivering it to anyone. I came to Seoul to negotiate a contract. That is still what I want to do. The only question on the table is whether you believe me." Vera translated it, word for word. No adjustments. This was the first time in the entire trip that she had translated without modifying or calibrating. She translated it straight because the sentence didn't need anything. It was already exactly what it needed to be. Victor Stone listened. He sat very still for a long time. Then he laughed. Quietly, genuinely. It was short, and then it was gone, but it was real. And Tommy blinked because he had never seen his uncle do that in a business meeting. Victor said something. Ivra translated. He says in 40 years of business, he can count on one hand the number of times an American businessman told him the truth without being forced to. He says he would like to continue the negotiation. Raphael nodded once. Tell him I appreciate that. She did. The meeting ran for another 90 minutes. Contract language. Specific terms. The work of two parties building something together rather than against each other. When it was over and they were in the elevator going down, Raphael said, "The word you added, soljiki. You didn't clear that with me." "No," she said. "You changed what I said. I translated what you meant." You and Victor were both circling. Someone's had to signal a way out. He was quiet for a moment. The elevator reached the lobby. "Don't do that again without telling me first," he said. Fair. A pause. Then quieter. "But it worked." "Yes," she said. It worked. They walked out into the Seoul afternoon. The city was loud and indifferent around them in the way cities are, always moving to the next thing regardless of what just happened. "The restaurant," he said. "Did it teach you that? Knowing when to stop circling?" She considered. "The restaurant taught me that people don't come in because they're hungry. They come in because they want to feel somewhere." Victor felt somewhere in that room today. That's why he told the truth. Raphael looked at her size. The look that had been accumulating across 3 days in Seoul. The particular attention of someone who was starting to understand that the person beside them is doing something they can't fully explain and couldn't replace. "What's the Korean word for what you just did?" he said. She thought for a moment. "There isn't exactly one. The closest is nunchi. What you exercised when you held that look and didn't still silence." She paused. "You have it. I told you. You told me. Did you believe me?" He looked forward. "I'm starting to." The small bar on the hotel's top floor had 8 tables, low lighting, and a view of Seoul that stretched to the edges of what the eye could hold. Raphael was sitting alone at the table by the window with a glass of Barolo that he had brought himself from New York, packed in his carry-on in a padded sleeve. because he did not trust other places to have what he needed for evenings like this one. His father's had been the same way about wine. He had been off the phone for 2 hours. His New York contact confirming the identity of the Hong Kong intermediary. Marcus Webb running the trace on how the documents had been routed through Marco's hands. His lawyer, who needed to know the outline of what was happening without needing to know all the specifics. Now, the calls were done. The work for tonight was done. He was just sitting. Vera appeared at the entrance to the bar. She was walking back from somewhere, her phone still in her hand, and she saw him through the glass and stopped. Looked at the chair across the table. He tilted his head slightly. She came in. She sat down and ordered a tea. She didn't drink when she was working. Whether she was still technically working was a question she hadn't answered yet. They didn't talk about the contract. Raphael talked about Naples. Not the way people talk about Plain as Miss, which always has a kind of performance to it. The way you talk us about something when it needs to come out of you. My father had a bar in Naples before he came to America. Small place. He made the espresso by hand every night. The regulars knew each other's children's names. That kind of place doesn't really exist anymore. Vera listened. Her hands were around the tea glass. Raphael talked for a few more minutes about Naples, about the neighborhood, about specific smell of that particular street in summer. And then something shifted in the way it does, when moved past the surface of what you're saying and arrived at the actual thing. He says in Italian, not translating himself, not expecting a response. Mi manca ancora. Ancia adesso. I still miss him, even now. And Vera answered him in Italian. Flawless, a central Roman accent. The Italian of someone who learned it not in a classroom, but by living inside it. Lo so. Le cose importanti non passano novo. I know. The important things don't really pass. Raphael put his wine glass down. He looked at her. You speak Italian, he said. In English. Yes, she said, in English. Since when? Since I was 8. My mother married an Italian man. I grew up in Rome. You've been hearing everything I've said in Italian for the last 4 days. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? It wasn't quite a question, but it needed an answer. She put her tea glass down. Looked at him directly. Because when people know I understand their language, they stop being careful. The things they say they think they're not being translated are usually the most accurate things they say. The information helps me do my job better. So this was professional methodology. That was part of it. What was the other part? The other part, she said, is that in 4 days, the things you said in Italian weren't professional information. They were things you said when you thought nobody was listening. She paused. About the documents. About Marco. About whether you trust Marcus. About your father.
I heard all of it, she said. And you're telling me now, because today you told the truth was the easier option. And I realized that I was going to sit with you.
He looked at her for a long moment. The Seoul skyline was behind her, all light and distance. Tell me what I said, he said quietly. She told him. About Marco, she said. You said, I can't believe Marco did this. In Italian, with the specific intonation of someone who is heartbroken and angry and is processing both at the same time. About Marcus, she said, you said, something is wrong? I can feel it. You said it to yourself, if not to anyone, just to put the somewhere. About her, she said, you said, I hope I can trust her. I need someone I can trust here. Yusa said it the second morning, before the second meeting, looking out the window. Raphael didn't move through any of this. About your father, she said, and her voice went a degree quieter. You said he would have known what to do here. He always knew how to be in a room where he was the outsider. I never learned how he did it. Silence. He figured it out the same way you're figuring it out right now, she said, by paying attention to the person in the room who understands what everyone else is saying. He looked at his hands. I'm not angry, he said. I want you to know that. I know. I should probably be angry. You could be, but you're not, because you're working out whether this changed anything or just changed what you know. He looked at her. Did it change anything? It changed what I know about you, she said. The things you said in Italian, when you thought you were alone with the language, are the truest things I've heard from. Which means which means I know who you are underneath the room you're running. He was quiet for a long time. The bar was almost empty. Someone's on the other side of the room was having a conversation too low to hear.
Your mother and the Italian, said finally.
Were they happy? 12 years. Very good 12 years. Then he died. Pancreatic cancer. 6 months from diagnosis to the end.
You stayed in Rome. I stayed for 3 more years.
I didn't know how to be Korean anymore. I'd learned everything in Italian. I dreamed in Italian. I fell in love for the first time in Italian. She paused. Eventually, I came home. You always go back to the first language. Yes, what's yours? Korean. I dream in Korean. She looked at him. What's yours? He thought about it, genuinely, not the quick answer. The real one, Italian. But I live in English. I know, she said. I could hear it from the first day. Italian is where you keep the things that matter. English is where you do business. A pause that wasn't uncomfortable. She opened her notebook. She opened it fully, in a way she hadn't before. Turned to his page and held it where he could see. This is what I wrote about you on day 1. He looked at the page. Mixed script, her private shorthand, nothing he could read. Read it to me, he said. She read. Speaks Italian when he means it. Speaks English when he's working. Pause before the most important thing. Trust slowly but completely. She closed the notebook. I added the last part tonight because I didn't get angry, because you didn't get angry and didn't pretend not to be affected. You sat with it. Let it be what it was. She looked at him. I don't meet many people who can do that. Silence settled again. Outside the windows, Sol kept running at the speeds Sol ran at. Different to what was happening in a small bar on a high floor. Vera, he said. What's the best word for tonight? Any language. She thought about it, really thought about it. Finalmente, she said. Italian. Not finally in the worn-out sense. In the sense of this was supposed to happen, and now it is at exactly the right time. He looked at her. The word sat in the air between them. Finalmente. He poured a little more wine into his glass and didn't say anything. But in his chest, something that had been in the same position for a very long time shifted half a degree. The next morning started with Marcus Webb at Raphael's door at 7 a.m. Marcus was a careful man. He had been Raphael's sole contact for 3 years, and in the time had never arrived unannounced. He was the kind of professional who understood that the manner in which information was delivered was as important as the information itself. The fact that he is standing in the hotel hallway without an appointment, with a look on his face that was doing its best to be neutral and not quite succeeding, said something before he opened his mouth. Victor Stone contacted me directly last night, Marcus said. He wants a private meeting with you. No interpreter. Just his nephew Tommy as a translator. Raphael stood back and let him in. What else? He wants the document returned to him directly. He doesn't want Vera Cole to know about the exchange. Why not? Marcus paused, cessed. He said the interpreter knows too much. He used the word liability. Liability to who? To him. Raphael moved to the window. The city below was already in full motion, the complicated machinery of a major city that never fully stopped. And your read on this? My read is that Victor is frightened, Marcus said. I don't think he's planning to harm anyone in a direct sense. But frightened people with resources make unpredictable decisions. He wants to centralize the person in the room who understands the most. That seems to be the calculation. She's doing her job. I know. But from where Victor stands, she's the point of vulnerability. If she talks to the wrong person about what she's heard in that meeting room, it's over for him. Raphael turned from the window. Vera stays in every meeting. Tell Victor I'll meet with him, but the conditions of that meeting are mine to set. Marcus nodded. He didn't argue. He had known Raphael long enough to understand when the decision was made. After Marcus left, Raphael went to find Vera. She's in the hotel workroom, reviewing notes for the afternoon session, a coffee going cold on the desk beside her. He told her straight, no softening. Victor wants to meet with me privately. He wants the document returned directly, and he doesn't want you involved in the exchange. He's told Marcus you're a liability. Vera set her pen down. I understand his logic. He wants to remove you from the situation. Yes, because I'm the person in the room who understands the most and the one he has least leverage over. She looked at Raphael calmly. He's frightened. Frightened people eliminate variables. I'm the variable that worries him. You're not a variable. To him I am. He looked at her. I want you to move to a different hotel tonight. Not because I think he'll do anything definitive. Because I don't want you sitting in the same building as a man who's decided you're the problem. You're worried about me, she said. I'm managing risk. Those aren't mutually exclusive. She studied him. I'll move hotels, not because I'm afraid, because there's no good reason not to do the sensible thing when you can. You're not going to argue. I've learned when to hold a position, and when a position is just stubbornness. Picked up her pen. But I come to every meeting. Obviously. She went back to her notes. He watched her for a moment. Vera. My father, if he were here, he would have liked you. She didn't look up, but something small changed of her shoulders. Not quite a smile, something quieter. Tell me what he was like sometime, she said. Not now. Sometime. He left her to her notes. That afternoon, Tommy Stone Asselstein found Vera alone in the lobby. She was waiting for the elevator. He appeared beside her, not from the direction of Victor's suite, and something about his posture said he hadn't been sent. Miss Cole, he said, can I have 5 minutes? She looked at him. Tommy Stone was 28 years old and had the specific discomfort of someone who has grown up in a world they didn't choose and has recently realized they're old enough to make different choices. 5 minutes, she said. They sat in a corner of the lobby, away from the front desk. Tommy spoke quietly and directly. He said his uncle was not a bad man. He said the decision had been made 25 years ago, when the company was under severe financial pressure and a government contract meant the difference between survival and collapse. He said the official who had received the payment had died 10 years ago. He said there was no living person who had been made less just by what happened. He said that if the document came out now, the people who would be hurt were 3,000 employees and a family that had since then built something real. Why are you telling me this? Vera said. Because I think Mr. Morrow is the wrong target, Tommy said. Someone put him in this position without his knowledge. And I think if there's anyone in this situation who can see the whole picture clearly, it's you. You want me to smell both sides. I want you to see the whole picture. Because I think the whole picture is being hidden from everyone, including my uncle. He looked at her. Someone built the situations deliberately. The question isn't who's built here. The question is who built it and what they wanted to happen. Vera looked at him for a moment. He met her eyes. There was no performance in it. You chose to come tell me this, she said, without your uncle's knowledge. Yes, that's not a small thing. No, he said, it isn't. She thanked him and went to find Raphael. She told him the entire conversation, word for word, no editing. Tommy is right, she said. Victor isn't the architect of this. He's a man who's been scared of one old document for 25 years, and someone has been using that fear. The person who built this knew your schedule, knew the document existed, knew how to place it, and knew exactly how Victor would react when he thought an American business partner was arriving with leverage against him. Someone who understood both sides. Someone who wanted both sides to destroy each other. That narrows it. It does. She looked at her notebook. Marcus needs to be excluded from whatever we do next. He looked at her. Why Marcus? Because your schedule was known 3 weeks before you finalized it. Victor's fear of the document was known to someone who also knew your cargo routes. Marcus sits at the intersection of all of that. He's worked with me for 3 years. I know. She met his eyes. I'm not saying he's the source. I'm saying he's the exposure point. Until we know more, keep the next step. Raphael sat with that for a moment. You're telling me to distrust my own people. I'm telling you to verify before you trust. There's a difference. You told me that first night that you move things across borders by routes that aren't always the most direct. Someone who wanted to hurt you would need to know those routes intimately. Marco knew them. Yes, and someone pressured Marco. She held his gaze. I don't think Marcus is a traitor. I think he might be compromised without knowing it. That's a different problem with a different solution. He was quiet for a long time. The meeting, tonight, he said finally. If I see Victor privately, What do I say? Tell him what I think he needs to hear. That you didn't build this, that the document isn't in play, and that you think there's a third party neither of you has identified yet. She paused. But don't meet him without me. He looked at her. He'll feel safer negotiating in a language I'm not part of, she said. But the reason he'll feel safer is the same reason I need to be there. I'm the only person in that room who hears everything. It was 11 p.m. Seoul time, which made it 9 a.m. in New Jersey. Raphael sat on the edge of the hotel bed and called the private number, the one that didn't go through the organization system, the one only 3 people had. Marco picked up on the 4th ring. His voice was not the voice of a man who had been dealing with a family health emergency. It was the voice of a man who had been waiting for this call with a specific kind of dread. The dread of something anticipated, something that had been coming for a while and had finally arrived. Raffled, Mars said. Tell me everything, Raphael said. From the start. And don't shape it. A long pause. Then Marco talked 3 months ago. An anonymous contact reaching him through a channel that Marco could not have traced even if he had tried. The contact had information about a side shipment Marco had handled 10 years back. Once. A single job, moving goods outside the official manifest for a private buyer. He had needed money urgently. His wife had been ill. The cost of treatment had been more than he had. Raphael hadn't known. Nobody had known.
And it. Place an envelope in Raphael Moro's carry-on luggage before
Died.
don't say anything.
Make yourself unavailable for the trip.
Tell
Whoever asked that it's a family emergency. They said it was commercial documents, Marxo said. Standard materials. I told myself that. I told myself it was nothing. You told yourself a lie because you were scared, Raphael said. Not angry. Flat. Which was worse. Yes. And you knew. Somewhere. You knew it wasn't nothing. Yes. You made me the vehicle for something I didn't know was carrying through into a meeting that could have gone very badly. A silence. Then, I know. I'm sorry, Sir Raphael. What was the voice like? The contact. Male. Older. He spoke Italian, but it wasn't native. Something off about the vowels. The consonants were harder than they should be at the ends of words. Vera was sitting across the small work table, a notebook open, pen in hand. Ask him to describe the vowels more specifically, she said quietly. Raphael repeated the question. Marco did his best. Shorter sounds. Rounded in a way that didn't fit the Italian language's natural tendency toward open vowels. Vera wrote more. Ask him if the speaker ever made errors with double consonants, she said. Italians double consonants instinctively. Learners usually underdo it. Marco said yes. The man had no trouble with doubled consonants. He often said them once, where a native Italian would have said them twice. Vera wrote a final note. This is a Slavic language speaker, she said. Polish is my best guess, possibly Czech or Slovak. The vowel shortening pattern and the consonant doubling problem both point to Slavic substrate. This person's just learned Italian as a 3rd or 4th language, not Snakasemkin. Raphael looked at her. You narrowed it from the entire world to Eastern Europe from a description of how someone mispronounced Italian. That's what 15 years of hearing people speak languages that aren't their own teaches you. She looked at her notes. A Polish or Czech national who speaks Italian well enough to conduct a coercion conversations, but imperfectly enough that a trained ear would notice. Working for someone with access to your shipping routes, Victor's corporate history, and enough resources to run an operation across multiple continents. This isn't personal, Raphael said. No, this is competitive. He sat back, looked at the ceiling. There's a Belgian company, Eureka Logistique. They've been trying to crack the East Asian freight market for 3 years. They've made offers to buy out 2 of my distribution partners in the last 18 months. I declined both approaches. He looked at Vera. They want the corridor I'm trying to build with Stone Specific. If this deal falls apart, and Victor and I spend the next year in legal dispute over what I was supposedly carrying and why, they walk into the vacuum. And if Victor's 1998 document surfaces publicly in the chaos, Stone Pacific collapses entirely, Vera said. They get the Korean side too. 2 birds, with 1 planted envelope. They looked at each other across the small work table in the Seoul room at midnight. It's very ordinary, Vera said. The answer is almost always very ordinary. I know, he said. The biggest crimes are always boring once you see them clearly. It's just someone wanting more than they have and being willing to hurt people for it. What do you want to do? He thought for a moment. I want to sit down with Victor Stone and tell him what I think is actually happening. Not the version that protects me specifically, the full version. Who I think is behind it, what they were trying to accomplish, and why neither of us benefited from staying at war with each other. He may not believe you. He may not. But right now, he's operating on incomplete information and making decisions based on fear. The only way to change that is to give him the full picture and let him decide. I'll need to be in that meeting. I know. Tommy should be there too. Why Tommy? Because Tommy already chose his side tonight when he came to talk to me. Victor needs to see that. It changes the weight of the conversation. Raphael looked at her. You think about this the way a strategist thinks. I think about it the way someone thinks who has spent years in rooms where people are not saying what they mean and has learned to plan around the distance between those two things. She closed her notebook. Tomorrow morning. Neutral location. Tommy arranges it. And Marcus. We tell Marcus afterward, not before. He nodded. Then, Vera. She was already gathering her notes. Yes, this stays between us tonight, whatever the outcome tomorrow. She looked at him. Something for quiet passed across her face. Of course, she said, as if there were no other answer. The meeting the next morning was in a restaurant in a neighborhood that belonged to the Sai, to neither, Sayab. Round, table, 4 chairs, no assistants. Victor Stone arrived 3 minutes early and sat with his hands folded. Tommy sat beside him. The specific quality of Tommy's posture said everything without words. He was not here as a subordinate. He was here as a person who judges. Raphael laid it all out, where the document had come from, how it had reached his luggage, what Marco had been coerced into, the description of the voice, Vera's analysis of the linguistic substrate, the pattern of behavior that pointed to a European competitor with specific access to both of their operations. Puis translated as Raphael spoke. Tommy translated in the other direction for the portions where Victor needed to respond. First time the interpreters were working toward exactly the same thing. Victor listened without interrupting. He had the stillness of a man who is reconfiguring what he knows while sitting very quietly in a chair. When Raphael finished, Victor said something in Korean. Tommy translated it. He says that 3 months ago, someone approached one of his subsidiary managers in Busansa. They wanted information about historical government contracts. The manager refused and reported it internally. My uncle didn't make the connection until now. The same organization, Vera said to Raphael under her breath. They were building the picture, both from sides simultaneously. Victor spoke again. Tommy translated. He says, if what you're telling me is accurate, then neither of us is the enemy of the other. And the person who made us believe we were has been studying our operations for longer than either of us realized. Tell him I agree, Raphael said. And tell him there's a way to verify it within 24 hours if he's willing to share the name of the person who approached his subsidiary manager. Tommy translated. Victor was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket and took out a business card. He placed it on the table and slid it toward Raphael. Vera looked at the card and said quietly to Raphael, the company on that card is a logistics consultancy registered in Brussels. It's a subsidiary vehicle. But I bet the parent company is Eureka Logistique. I know who to call, Raphael said. Victor spoke one more time. Tommy's voice was steady as he translated. He says, I have been afraid of that document for 25 years. I have made decisions out of that fear that I am not proud of. But today you gave it back to me without conditions. That is the kind of man my uncle says he wants to do business with. Raphael looked across the table at Victor Stone. The older man was watching him with the careful attention of someone assessing a calculation they had held for a long time. Tell him the contract is still on the table, Raphael said, and tell him I'd like to sign it. The contract signings happened 2 days later. Clean, formal. The language of agreements, built on actual agreements, rather than performances of agreements. Victor Stone was different in that room than he had been in the first meeting. Not warmer, exactly. More present. The specific quality of someone who has set down something heavy and is finding that their arms work differently without it. Tommy handled the final formalities. He translated the boilerplate with the precision of someone of some doing the job they were trained for. Vera sat in the corner, not needed for this part, reading something on her phone. When it was done, Victor walked past Vera on his way out. He paused, said something in Korean, just to her, quietly. She nodded once. After he left, Raphael came to stand beside her. What did he say? He said I was better at this than just translating. He thought I should know that. And what did you say? I said I know. Raphael looked at her. Do you? Actually, I'm learning to believe it. She looked back at him. There's a difference between knowing something and being able to let yourself believe it. I'm working on the second part. He nodded. Quiet for a moment. I want to take you to dinner tonight, he said. Not as a professional courtesy, as a person taking another person to dinner. She looked at him directly. That's a different kind of sentence. I know what kind of sentence it is. She thought about it for a moment. Okay, she said. But I choose the restaurant, he smiled. A real one, the kind that didn't have any management in it. You always choose the restaurant. Yes, she said. Because I have better taste, he laughed, quiet and genuine. The laugh of a man who didn't do it that often and found when he did that it felt good. Dinner was at a small place in Bukshan that Vera had been to once years ago and had remembered ever since. The kind of place that had outlasted all the restaurants around it by being exactly what it was without apology. They ate. They talked. Not about contracts or documents or the week they had just been through. He told her about the bar in Naples. She told him about Rome in autumn. The particular light on stone buildings is October. The way the city smelled when the temperature dropped. He told her about his mother, who still lived in New Jersey and called every Sunday and asked the same 3 questions every time. She told him about hers in Seoul, who called at 7 a.m. regardless of what time zone Vera was in, because her mother had never learned to convert times and had decided that Cephazine was universal. He told her about what he had actually built, not the version he told business associates, the real version, the one that had started in his father's garage with a connection to a man in Sicily who knew where to find certain vintage cars that weren't feeding through regular channels. The version that had grown, slowly, into something much larger, carrying all of that history in its foundations. She told him what she had actually been looking for when she left interpretation and went to carry plates food for strangers. Not escape, she said, not simplicity. Honesty. The specific honesty of a transaction where the exchange was visible and direct. You brought food, people ate it. That was the whole thing. Did you find it? He said. Mostly, she said, but I started to miss the other thing. Which other thing? The moment when language actually connects two people who couldn't connect without it. When I translate correctly, really correctly, the whole person and not just the words, and I can feel the gap close. She paused. There's nothing quite like that. I had forgotten. You remembered it this week. Yes. He looked at his glass. I don't want to go back to having a different interpreter, he said. Not a negotiation. Just a statement of something true. She looked at him. Let the sentence be what it was. Milan, he said odd. Yes, 2 months. Yes, Italian and English. No Korean. No Korean. She picked up her glass. You don't need an interpreter for Italian and English. I know. So you're not offering me work. I'm offering you something I don't have a word for yet. He looked at her directly, which is why I need someone who's good with language. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, Seoul continued to run at the speed Seoul ran at, indifferent and magnificent. The restaurant was warm. The food was good. I'm going to Rome first, she said. I have 2 weeks of work there. I know. Then I'll consider Milan. That's all I'm asking. She smiled. The real one. Not the professional one. Not the polite one. The one that was hers. They sat there for a while longer than the dinner strictly required. The last morning in Seoul, Raphael was packed, his carry-on checked twice this time, which made him feel briefly like a person who didn't trust himself, and then briefly like a person who had learned something, and then like both at once. His flight to New York was at 1 p.m. Vera's flight to Rome was at 11. They met in the lobby at 9, which gave them 2 hours before she had to leave for the airport. It had not been arranged. It was simply where they both were. They had coffee in the lobby restaurant. She had a briefcase she hadn't had the first day. She looked, he thought, different from the woman who had been standing at the hotel entrance 7 days ago, with the work bag and a takeaway up. Not different in a way he could paint to. Different in the way people are different when something has moved in them. What happens when you get back to New York? She said. I deal with the Eureka logistics situation through the appropriate channels. My lawyers have what they need. Victor's lawyers have what they need. Jan Kowalczyk's career in business intelligence is effectively over. He paused. And I call Marco. What will you say? I haven't decided yet. He looked at his coffee. He was afraid, and he had no one to help him. That's different from choosing to betray someone. I know the difference. A pause. But he still needs to understand what almost happened. And then, I look for a new interpreter. Someone with the right credentials. He looked at her. Someone who will probably be significantly less effective than the person who filled in this week. She smiled. You could always hire me, I could. But I think what I want is more complicated than a professional arrangement. She looked at him. Something settled. Yes, she said. I think so too. At the airport, they went to the departures hall together. Her gate was in one direction. His was in the other. She took out the notebook. She turned to his page, the one she had been writing on since the first day, and she read the whole thing to him. She had written about the pausing before important things, the left hand, the Italian when something was real, the nunci he had without a name for it, the way he held sis in a negotiation room, the way he had handed back the documents without conditions, the way he had told his father's story in a hotel bar, like something that needed to be said out loud. And at the bottom, a final line she had written last night. She read it. It says, asked for the word he didn't have. That is new. That is the rarest thing. He looked at her. Now, she said. She tore the page out cleanly, folded it, held it out. He took it, looked at it. The handwriting was her private script, the mixed language shorthand, nothing he could read. What does the last word say? She said it in Korean, Sanjibi said. Tell me. It's a type of mushroom, she said, very rare. It grows only when specific conditions are all true at the same time. The soil, the temperature, the moisture, everything aligned at once. Most of the people who find it are looking for something else entirely. He looked at the page in his hands. You wrote a mushroom. I wrote a metaphor. She picked up her bag. Send me the Milan dates. She looked at him one more time. The look of someone who is going to a place they know and will come back from it. Take care of yourself, Raphael. You too. She walked toward her gate. She didn't look back. He stood in the Incheon Airport departures hall, holding a torn notebook page, watching her until she turned a corner and was gone. Then he reached into his inside's breast pocket and took out the old folded paper. His father's name, written in his own hand 30 years ago. The night after Antonino Moro had died in a Newark hospital room, where no one understood a single word he said, he held both pieces of paper. His father's, hers. He put hers in the inside breast pocket, beside father's, besides it, the place he kept the things that mattered. He picked up his bag and walked toward his gate. His phone buzzed. David. Car is arranged on the New York side. Anything you need before landing. No, Raphael said. I've got everything I need. On the plane, somewhere over the Pacific, he looked at the page again. The handwriting he couldn't read. The word he would look up when he landed, but already understood. He thought about his father, about a man who had crossed an ocean with $40 and built something with his hands in a language he learned one painful word at a time. Who had known how to be in a room where he was the outsider, how to read it, how to wait for the right moment, how to make himself understood across every gap. He had learned it the easy way, in the end, by paying attention to the person in the room who understood what everyone else was saying. In Rome, 2 months later, a small restaurant near the Campo de Fiori, autumn leased on stone, the city going about its ancient business. Vera was there before him. She always was. She was standing at the entrance to the restaurant with a coffee, looking at the street, and when his car pulled up, she turned toward it before it stopped, the way people do when they're paying attention. He got out of the car. She looked at him, the real look. The one he had first seen at the end of a dinner in Seoul when a server made a joke and Vera laughed without managing it. "You're on time," she said. "You told me to be on time. I tell everyone to be on time. You're the only one who actually is." He looked at her. There was a lot he could have said. He had thought about several versions of it on the plane from New York. What he said was, "I looked up the word." She waited. "Songshibioset," he said. His pronunciation was better than it had been in Seoul. He had been practicing. "I looked it up, and I read about it, and I understand the metaphor. And I want to see if the conditions are right." She smiled. The real one.
Me, too, she said. I'm in Rome. She opened the door to the...
"Come on," she said.
They have espresso that will remind you of Naples. Well, somewhere in the back of his mind, in the language where he kept the things that actually mattered, a single word settled into place. Final mente. Finally.
Not the tired kind. Not the kind that comes after too long waiting. The kind that means this is the moment that's supposed to happen ben. And exactly the right time. There are people you meet because of work. There are people you meet because you happen to be in the place being at the same time. And then very rarely, you meet someone at the moment when both of you are being exactly who you are, no more and no less, and neither of you planned for what happened next. Rafael Fumso spent from controlling every room he walked into, like he controlled the language. What he hadn't known, until a Tuesday night in Lower Manhattan when a waitress put his money on an empty table and said his name likes it was just a name verse, was this. The most important thing was never the language you speak. It was whether someone was willing to translate you honestly. He had been waiting for that without knowing the word for it. Now he did. It had been in Italian the whole time. Finalmente. If you made it to the end, thank you. Genuinely. This story started with a very small moment, giving back a tip. It sounds like nothing, but in that moment, something very specific happened. A person with less power held her line in front of a person with more, not aggressively, not submissively, just clearly, and with complete certainty about who she was.
That is the rarest thing.
Not the grand gesture, not the dramatic stand. The quiet, steady decision to remain yourself when it would be easier not to. Vera didn't learn that from a book. She learned it from years of being in rooms where people weren't saying what they meant, and from 2 years of carrying plates of food for strangers and discovering that honesty is its own kind of freedom. And Raphael didn't find what he was looking for in a business deal. He found it in the space between what he said and what it actually was, in the hands of someone who had the skill and the integrity to translate both. The word for that, in any language, is rare. Take care of each other out there. We'll see you in the next story. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.
Before we close this story, I want to sit with you for a moment. Because what just happened across 10 chapters wasn't really about a business deal. It wasn't about documents hidden in a suitcase or a logistics contract in Seoul. Those were just the surface. The real story was something quieter, something most people walk past their entire lives without noticing. It was about what happens when a person finally gets translated correctly. Think about Rafael Moro, a man who controlled every room he entered for 20 years, powerful, precise, untouchable. And yet the one thing he had never been able to protect himself against was the silence his father died in. One man in a hospital room in Newark, asking for water in a language nobody understood. That silence had been living inside Raphael ever since. And no amount of money, no number of closed deals, no size of empire had ever been able to fill it. Then he met a woman who handed back his money and told him exactly where the line was. That moment at the restaurant table, that small, quiet, unspectacular moment, was the whole story. Not the drama in Seoul, not the documents, not the rival company. The real turning point was a waitress who had every reason to stay quiet and chose not to. Who held her dignity without raising her voice? Who drew a boundary not out of anger, but out of a completely settled knowledge of who she was? Vera Cole taught us something that no boardroom and no battlefield ever will. Real strength is not about what you can take. It is about what you choose not to use when you could. Raphael had the leverage in Seoul. He had the document. He could have used it. He gave it back instead. And in doing so, he became someone Victor Stone could trust, someone Vera Cole chose to stay beside, and someone his father would have recognized. The lesson is this. We spend so much of our lives building armor, building power, building walls that keep the wrong people out. But sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is let someone in who is honest enough to tell us what our words actually mean. Not everyone can do that. Not everyone earns the right to. When you find the person who translates you correctly, who hears not just what you say, but what you mean underneath it, hold on to that. That is the rarest thing in the world, and it was always worth more than the empire.